Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown, the podcast where we discuss current regulatory complexities facing the life science industry and explore innovative ways to overcome those challenges. I am your host, Nicholas Catman, President and CEO of the FDA Group. Before we get started, here's a quick word about who we are. The FDA Group is a technology and consulting firm that helps life science companies in the areas of regulatory submissions, audit projects, mock inspections, staff augmentation, and remediation. So if you find yourself in need, just head over to the fdagroup.com to check us out and get in touch. So today we are going to be talking about a very interesting topic. It is how can early regulatory partnerships help companies navigate heightened scrutiny as they scale and avoid costly rework? So on today with me is Leland Keyt. Hey Leland, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Absolutely. So before we jump into the podcast, would you kindly introduce yourself?
Sure. Um, as Nicholas said, my name is Leland Keyt. I've been working in the medical device industry for more than 20 years. I've been spanning work with startups, mid-sized organizations, and global multinational companies. I've had the privilege to work on products and with product teams through product design, development, and commercialization. I specialize primarily in therapeutics, implantable therapeutics, in fact, but I've also had the privilege to work on assessment systems, software as a medical device, and other monitoring systems. I'm currently the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Quality Assurance at Apreo Health.
Okay, super. Thank you so much. So let's jump right into it. So, what does early regulatory partnership actually mean in practice, and how early is early enough?
It's a great question. I would say that early is at concept phase, really making sure that you are incorporating regulatory in a lot of those early development discussions, your first in human discussions. Um, I think that you can find ways to be really efficient in those strategies.
Mhm.
And there are a number of ways that there can be support. Um, Early concept phase is typically when we're looking at IP and utilizing IP in your narrative on how you're describing the product can come in very handy several years down the line and
Mm.
in regulatory submissions. So I do think that there's a lot of opportunity for regulatory support to be beneficial in those early concept phases.
What would you say is typically the time that most life science companies engage regulatory expertise? And in addition to that, where do you see the most preventable rework occurring?
Typically, it's when they're ready to do a regulatory submission. So
Right.
whether it be to do some type of clinical work, or if it's in a 510(k) when they're ready to do this 510(k). I would say you definitely want to be prior to that. You want to be in that development phase where you're developing the testing strategies or those clinical strategies. Um, Finding ways to make sure that you're incorporating what the current regulators are thinking
Hmm.
um, is important as you're developing test protocols, making sure that they are being written with the right kind of lens and focus
Mm.
for the audience that is going to be used.
Yeah. Not only is there an opportunity to kind of avoid some rework when you engage regulatory expertise early on, but one of the things that we've seen a lot of is companies will actually do more testing than they need to. And so I think it's really not only positive in terms of getting things done the right way, but making sure you're only doing those things that are going to add value to what you're developing.
Absolutely. Especially in the early stages, efficiency is the key. Like, what can you do to answer the right questions with the least amount of data?
Hmm. Well, let's talk about FDA scrutiny. So, what are some of the most common scaling mistakes that can kind of heighten that?
I would say it's around that risk tolerance. How much risk are you incorporating into your program? especially with the transition to ISO 1345 and really looking at a lot of the different risk assessments, bringing risk into a lot of those discussions. And when that's not incorporated, um, you might not see it at the beginning of, say, an IDE, but at the PMA, that's when they'll start digging into things, or when they're in audits, that's when they'll start
Mm,
digging into things. So really making sure that you are thinking about design FMEAs and how that risk is informing your testing plans, I think is really important. Um, I think once you've kind of gotten over those initial market applications, now you're talking about post-market surveillance and really neglecting those post-market surveillance requirements and responsibilities can be a really big issue. Once you have an approval or a clearance, you need to maintain some of these requirements in order to not get into issues with FDA or other regulatory bodies.
mm. One of the I think common questions a lot of companies have is how does the regulatory strategy need to change as a company is transitioning from the development stage to commercial operations?
Again, I think you're going to hear me say this a lot, risk tolerance.
Mm,
What you're willing to accept at the early stages may look very different at a commercial perspective. FDA doesn't come in at the early point at the time, but once you are at a PMA, you have PMA pre-approval inspection, but after that, you have a lot of audits. So there's a lot of risk that you need to really make sure that you are appropriately mitigating and addressing as you grow. When you're learning in that development phase, sometimes some of those risks are worth taking.
mm.
Whereas as you get a little bit further along in the maturity of the company or commercialization, they are not. I think you have to make sure you're resourcing properly as well. Post-market,
Can you
what
define what that means, just so everybody's clear?
absolutely. I think resourcing, what you need in development may not be exactly what you need when you're commercialization.
It's a
When
polite way to
you're
put it.
and if you continue to develop, which is great, you may just need to add more. I think it's really important to recognize once you get an approval or a clearance, whether it be in the United States or elsewhere, you do have to keep it. You do have to maintain it. And especially on the regulatory side, it kind of happens underneath the water. You don't really see it. It just kind of happens. There's reports
Mm,
that have to be done. There's adverse event reporting. All of these things kind of happen. And if you're still developing something, your Gen 2, your Gen 3, you've got lots of people trying to juggle two things and you might just run out of resource. So making sure that you're resourced properly to support all of the endeavors of the company are really important.
We talked earlier about kind of regulatory rework. So, for the founders and executives that are listening, what are some of the hidden costs that they can potentially avoid when engaging regulatory expertise early on?
I think timeline is a really big thing, especially for early stage startups when you have Series A money or seed money, that money's expensive and your
Mm,
run rate is really important. So you don't want to slow down that timeline. You want to be efficient in it so that you are
mm,
stretching your cost and your money as far as you can. Obviously, you want to hit your deadlines. But I think when you're reworking, that's also product cost. And so
mm,
what we don't consider is we built product, we tested it, something failed or something didn't go wrong. We have to do that again. That's a whole supply chain issue. Do you have enough product to build everything else again? Takes time. Uh, if you're working on that, you're not working on other things. So it really is a bit about your time management, your deadlines, and efficiency.
mm. And when we think about regulatory involvement, I think our minds generally go straight to compliance documentation as being kind of a main part of it. But I know in our conversations leading up to the podcast, we talked about how it can shape better product development decisions. So can you speak to that a little bit?
I think a lot of it is, again, kind of around those strategies. Different geographies have different requirements. And so making sure you understand what it is that you are working towards. And just because you've always done it one way doesn't mean you're necessarily going to do it that way for, say, Japan or for the EU. I think biocompatibility is a really good example of that. What the US needs, everyone says it's 10993-1, but how that's interpreted across different geographies could potentially change the way that you develop and what you do and when you do it. So looking at the geographies so that we're making efficient decisions with our testing, I think is really helpful.
We talked a little bit about when we're going from development to commercial, how that can impact regulatory infrastructure. But let's take a step back. So, what are some of the signals, and not necessarily from development to commercial, but that's an obvious one. But what are some of the signals that indicate that a company is on the verge of outgrowing what it currently has in place?
I think it's the moving of the phases of the company as you're moving from development into maybe animal work or moving
Hmm.
into first in human or a pilot or a pivotal study. But all of those big phases of a organization as it's going is a really good time to kind of take stock at, do we have the right resources? Do we need to bring in different expertise? That
Hmm.
doesn't mean that the expertise that you have isn't necessary, but maybe we need something else or in addition to.
Hmm.
Those are really inflection points of, especially from a regulatory perspective, because they typically end with a submission of some sort and they're getting ready for another type of submission of some sort. So it's a really good way to kind of go as we're looking forward for the next phase. What do we have? Are we doing the right things? Do we have the right people? Do we have the right expertise?
Hmm. Yeah, and there's a lot of different ways to, for lack of a better term, skin the cat, right?
Mhm.
In certain instances, you really need full-time employees. In other instances, you need a high-level strategist and visionary. Other times, you might need some temporary resources. So there's FSP models, there's outsourcing models, there's all sorts of different ways that I think can kind of fit in those transitions, and what might be the appropriate strategy to take in one moment might not be the best strategy to take in the next phase.
And that might change company to company, dependent
Hmm.
on how the company operates as well. So I think that's a really important piece is that flexibility of really taking stock of that company. What is it that they need? And as they proceed, making sure that you're providing a number of options so that informed decisions can be made.
Yeah. Well, speaking of flexibility, let's talk about how leadership teams can balance speed to market pressures with long-term compliance durability.
For this side to me is all about education.
Hmm.
It's a big team. Maybe it's small, but there's a lot of different things going on. And so educating people on the risks that we're taking, understanding what risk we're willing to take, that risk will likely evolve over time. Um, but providing a lot of information so an informed decision can be made. One decision is usually not made by one disciplinary group. It's a number of them coming together and trying to find the best solution for the problem, and ensuring that people are educated across the board on the different aspects and consequences of a decision is really important. One decision might be great for manufacturing, but might be horrible for quality,
Hmm.
might be really bad for regulatory, but it might be the right decision to take.
Right.
But without that information and awareness, it's
Hmm.
really hard to make that informed decision. And the last thing you really want to do is make a decision and then find out all of those consequences later.
Yeah. So a great example of that is in board level conversations, especially during high growth phases. So can you share with the audience what type of value regulatory can play during those types of conversations?
Typically, when I think of high growth, I think about commercial expansion. And
Hmm.
so, how is that happening? Making really smart decisions on when you're growing and when to, like, how to grow is important. And there's a lot of geographies out there. And from a regulatory perspective, some of them are much easier than others. Some of them require a lot more. And so being in tune with what the board's looking at, what sales and marketing are thinking are for the better markets for growth, and being able to provide insight on how to get into those geographies is really helpful. Again, we go back to those post-market surveillance and resourcing areas. You want to make sure that you are appropriately supported to be able to maintain those approvals once you receive them. Um, an example would be is like we're going to Israel, but if you only get 3 cases a year, is that really the best use of time and effort? So really making sure that you're talking through understanding what are the requirements to get there and to stay there, and making sure people are aware of that, because if you're working on that, you're not working on other things.
Yeah. One of the things that leadership really wants to avoid is, being reactive. How can companies structure their regulatory departments in a way that is very strategic and forward-looking?
I think it's important to understand the goals. You
Hmm.
have to understand what is important to the company and for what reasons, so that you're supporting those decisions throughout your thinking, your strategic way of approaching things. If it's about value add, then you have to figure out what it is from a regulatory perspective. And maybe we might want to take a different approach to FDA. We might want to think about breakthrough technologies. We might want to go somewhere else to get information sooner because it's faster. So being able to understand what it is the goal of the company, so that you can support that ultimate goal as it moves forward. And so as those change, being part of those discussions so that you can, in some cases, inform some of them, help the regulatory leaders be important during some of the execution, because we understand why we're doing what we're doing.
Hmm. One of the things people love to talk about, either from a learning perspective or from a validation perspective, meaning that what they think is true, is what are regulators paying closer attention to now than they were, say, 3 to 5 years ago? So, from what you've seen anecdotally, or maybe what you've heard from a broader perspective, can you comment on that?
I mean, I think AI is probably one of the
Okay,
big ones.
sure.
But fundamentally of how to use it, how to regulate it, whether it be within a device or within the development process, I think those are some really key questions. If you're looking at Europe, they're thinking about how AI is used when people are doing clinical evaluation reports, and making sure that it's very clear that you're just not using AI, but you're interpreting that information yourself. So you can use it, but how you use it's really important. And I think that goes across the board when it comes to AI. I think some of the things that are never changing, at least in FDA, is, biocompatibility, how to approach biocompatibility. We're hearing some things might be moving a little bit on that line, on that topic. Um, Usability, I think, is a big one, especially for these projects that are a little bit longer term, meaning that it takes a longer time for them to develop. You kind of get going and we're thinking about design verification and validation, and you forget about that usability, making sure
Mm,
that's part of the feedback loop as you're developing, to make sure that you're making a product that can be used and used
mm,
well by a varied group of individuals that uh, have different skill sets,
mm.
whether it be a patient or a physician.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, especially for FDA, moving to ISO 1345 for that QSMR is not necessarily a big deal, but I think there are aspects of your audits that were not inbounds are now inbounds. So
Mm,
thinking about like management review, but just being prepared for those types of scrutiny as you're getting into um, your audit season, or if you're doing pre-approval inspections, and recognizing how FDA is using AI.
mm,
They're using AI in different ways, and making sure you understand that so that you
mm.
can ask the right questions or be able to respond appropriately.
Yeah, just a sneak peek for the audience. So we're going to be actually doing so we have a tool called ICA, or the Audit Intelligence Compliance Assistant. FDA uses something very similar, and we're actually going to be doing a whole analysis of FDA's tool for everybody to learn. So that should be coming out hopefully before the end of summer. So if that's on anybody's list of interests, just make sure you're following the FDA group on LinkedIn and keep an eye out.
Yes, ma'am.
Um, so so let's round this whole thing out. So if you could give life science CEOs one piece of advice to avoid costly compliance missteps, what would it be?
I would say build and develop a scalable QMS system. That is something that is the bedrock. It's the foundation of what you're developing. And if it's not solid, other things are easy to fall apart. It's not an afterthought. It happens kind of behind the scenes, but it's not an afterthought. Utilize your quality management reviews. They can be a really informative tool to understand how the strength of that quality system is going. Really making sure that you are bringing the right people at the table when you're having these issues to make sure that when decisions are made, they're informed decisions.
Awesome. Very prudent advice. Really appreciate your insight and your participation in this podcast. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And for everybody listening, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. Subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast, and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn for industry updates and cutting edge insights. If you'd like to talk about project or resource needs, just head over to thefdagroup.com to get in touch, or feel free to connect with me personally on LinkedIn. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and we will see you all in the next rundown.